My parents sold my 12-year-old son's custom gaming PC, the one he'd built himself with money from his paper route over 2 years, for $1,800 to pay for my brother's Las Vegas bachelor party. They said he plays too many video games anyway. When his computer science teacher found out, she didn't cry. She smiled. Calm. Measured. And she said that computer had. And paused just long enough to let the silence stretch. My father stood up frozen. My mother set down her coffee cup so carefully it didn't make a sound. They were pale. Both of them. The kind of pale that happens when you realize the thing you dismissed was worth far more than you understood, and that someone else knew that before you did. Let me take you back to the beginning. Because what happened in that school conference room on a Tuesday afternoon in January 2026 didn't come from nowhere. It came from 2 years of a 12-year-old boy waking up at 5:45 in the morning before school, folding newspapers in the dark, and putting every dollar he earned into a shoebox under his bed because he had a plan. It came from months of watching YouTube tutorials about CPU thermal paste and PCIe slots and GPU benchmarks. It came from a kid who knew exactly what he wanted and went and earned it quietly, without asking anyone for help, certainly not asking my parents, because he'd already learned by that point that asking my parents for certain things got you a lecture about priorities rather than any actual support. I'm Renata. I'm 38 years old. I'm a single mother. I work as a senior compliance analyst for a regional finance firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I have been doing that job for 11 years. My son's name is Marcus. He is, as of last November, officially 13, though this whole story unfolded when he was still 12. And my parents, Gerald and Diane Howell of Mooresville, North Carolina, have spent approximately the entire length of my adult life assuming that I was managing, but not thriving, coping, but not succeeding, surviving, but not quite arriving at anything that mattered. That assumption was the engine of everything that followed. My parents have always had a complicated relationship with Marcus. They love him. I believe that, genuinely, but their love comes wrapped in a specific kind of conditional approval that I recognized long before Marcus was born because I grew up inside it. In the Howell household, worth was measured in outputs they could see and brag about at church. My brother Devin, for years younger than me, played varsity baseball in high school and went on a partial scholarship to Appalachian State, and my father talked about that scholarship at every family gathering for approximately 6 consecutive years. My academic achievements: summa cum laude from UNC Charlotte, 2 professional certifications, a consistent record of performance reviews that read like small monuments to competence, were acknowledged the way you acknowledge someone holding a door open. A nod. That's nice. And then the conversation moved along. Marcus doesn't play sports. He doesn't particularly want to. What Marcus does is think. He reads technical manuals for fun. He built his first functioning circuit board at age 9 using a kit I found at a hobby store, and when he was 10 he wrote a script in Python, actual Python, not a tutorial copy-paste, that automatically organized the music files on my laptop by album release date. He showed it to me at dinner, and I just sat there for a moment because I genuinely didn't know what to say. I was impressed. I was also a little bit awed at this small person I'd created who clearly had a brain that worked on a frequency I couldn't always follow. My parents were less impressed. In fact, when I tried to share some of these moments with them, the circuit board, the Python script, an essay Marcus wrote for his 5th grade science fair that his teacher later submitted to a regional competition, my mother's standard response was something like, "That's wonderful, but he needs to make sure he's getting exercise. Boys need to be active." And my father, who retired from a career in commercial HVAC installation, would say things like, "He spends too much time indoors. He needs to learn how things work in the real world." The irony of that last one still sits with me. Because Marcus was, during all of this, learning exactly how things work in the real world. Just not the version of it that my father recognized. The paper route started in September of 2023. Marcus came to me with a printed sheet from the Charlotte Observer showing the community distribution rates for weekend carriers in our zip code. He had calculated with a spreadsheet, because of course he had, that if he picked up the Thursday through Sunday route in our neighborhood and banked everything after his modest weekly spending, he'd have approximately $1,800 in 22 months. I asked him what the $1,800 was for. He showed me a parts list on PC Part Picker. He had already spec'd out the entire build: the AMD Ryzen 7 processor, the NVIDIA RTX 4060 graphics card, the Corsair Vengeance RAM, the NZXT case. He'd priced everything to the penny and accounted for a small buffer in case component prices shifted. He was 11 years old. I signed the parental permission form for the paper route the same evening. He never missed a single morning. Not one. I know this because I was up most of those mornings, not to help him, he didn't want help, but because I'm a light sleeper and I'd hear him moving around in the dark at 5:45, the soft thud of his sneakers in the hallway, the click of the front door. Some mornings in January 2024, when the temperature in Mooresville dropped below 20 degrees, I would lie awake in bed and listen to him go, and I would feel something in my chest that I don't have a word for. It was somewhere between pride and ache. He was doing it. He was doing it every single day, steadily, without complaint, and he was 9 months away from his goal, and he didn't see any of that as extraordinary. He just saw it as the steps required to get what he wanted. My parents saw it differently when they saw it at all. In April of 2024, my mother watched Marcus doing his Thursday route from the window of my kitchen. He was 12 by then. It was spring. There was actual sunlight, and she said, "I don't think this is good for him. A boy his age shouldn't be doing labor like this. It seems like something that should be done by someone who needs the money." I looked at her for a moment. He does need the money. He's saving for something specific. What could a 12-year-old possibly need $1,800 for? A computer. She made a face. The specific face she makes when she thinks something is wasteful but doesn't want to say so directly. Gerald and I could just get him one. Something sensible. A laptop. He wants to build one himself. Why? That was the question she kept asking. Why? Why would someone do something the hard way when there was an easier version available? Why would a child want to earn something when it could simply be given to him? She asked it without realizing that the answer was a complete portrait of everything she didn't understand about Marcus. He wanted to build it himself because the building was the point. The machine at the end was almost secondary. He wanted to be someone who had done the thing, who had held every component, understood what it did, seated it correctly, booted the system for the first time and known, with the certainty that comes from having done the work, that if something went wrong, he could find it and fix it. That wasn't something a laptop from Best Buy could give him. But I didn't explain all of that to my mother. I'd learned a long time ago which conversations were worth having and which ones were just me talking into a wall. In August 2024, Marcus hit his number. 19 months into the paper route, not 22, he'd picked up 2 additional houses on an adjacent block after one of the regular carriers moved away. He came into the kitchen on a Saturday morning and laid out the shoebox. Inside it was $1,847 in sorted bills and a folder with his PC Part Picker list, the Newegg and Amazon links, and a handwritten note to himself that said, "Do not buy on impulse. Wait for the weekend sale." He waited for the weekend sale. We ordered the parts together on a Saturday night in late August 2024. They arrived over the course of the following week, and Marcus assembled the entire machine over a long weekend, starting Friday evening and finishing Sunday afternoon. He watched one tutorial video on seated the CPU correctly and paused it, did the step, then watched the next segment. He applied the thermal paste in the X pattern he'd read was optimal. He cable managed everything with zip ties before closing the case, because, as he explained to me, it affects airflow and it also just looks better when you open it up later. He booted it on Sunday at 4:12 in the afternoon and the post screen came up clean on the first try. He didn't celebrate loudly. He just sat back in his desk chair and looked at it for a moment, and then he said, "Okay." And that was it. That was the whole celebration. I took a photo of him sitting in front of the machine. He's looking directly at the camera, and he's not smiling in the way kids smile when they're performing happiness for a photo. He's just steady. There's something in his expression that I've thought about 100 times since, a kind of quiet certainty that's very rare in a 12-year-old. Like he knew exactly who he was and had just finished proving it to himself. By October 2024, Marcus was using the machine daily. He joined an after-school program for student programming at Hadley Middle School, run by a teacher named Ms. Eleanor Bryce, who taught computer science to 6th through 8th graders. MS. Bryce is one of those teachers who recognizes a certain kind of student immediately. She told me later that Marcus walked into her lab on the first day of the school year, saw the school's equipment, mostly Chromebooks and a few aging Dell towers, and asked her, very politely, if it would be acceptable for him to bring in his own machine for certain projects. She said yes. She also said that by the 3rd week of class, Marcus was sitting in on the 8th grade sessions after school because he'd already completed the 6th grade curriculum independently. I didn't tell my parents about any of this at the time. Not because I was protecting Marcus from them, he didn't particularly need protection, but because I'd learned that sharing his accomplishments with them was often the beginning of a subtle diminishment that left me feeling worse than if I'd kept quiet. My mother would ask if he was keeping up in his other subjects. My father would say something about how computers were fine, but Marcus needed to understand that trades were where the real work was. And I'd walk away from the conversation carrying some small, invisible weight I didn't want. So I kept it quiet. And the months moved forward. And Marcus kept going to MS. Bryce's class, and he kept building things on his computer at home, and he kept getting up every morning and doing his paper route, which had now shifted to just Saturdays and Sundays since he'd hit his savings goal. He kept the weekend route going because he'd started saving for a second project he wouldn't tell me about yet, which I found equal parts endearing and intimidating. Then Devin announced his engagement. Devin met his fiancée, Christy, in the spring of 2024 and proposed to her in Hawaii in November 2024. He texted me a photo of the ring before he posted it on Instagram, which was the most personal communication we'd had in about 4 months. The wedding was set for April 2026. This was all fine. Devin is my brother, and I'm not indifferent to his happiness, even if we've never been particularly close. The bachelor party, however, was a different matter. Devin's friend group planned a Las Vegas weekend in January 2026. For nights at the Venetian Resort, a private table at Omnia nightclub on Friday night, a paid golf package at Shadow Creek on Saturday morning followed by 2 bottle service sessions. The cost per person was initially quoted at $2,400, split 10 ways among the attendees. Devin paid his own share. The problem was that 2 people dropped out 3 weeks before the trip, and the organizer informed the group that each remaining person would need to cover an additional $267 in shared costs. Devin called my father about the shortfall. I wasn't on that call. I found out about it later from my mother, who mentioned it in a very specific way, in the middle of a conversation about something else, dropped in without transition, the way she delivers information she suspects will be received poorly. We helped Devin with some extra money for his bachelor trip, she said. You know how these things end up costing more. That's fine, I said. How much? She paused. It ended up being more like $1,800. Something in my chest went still. Where did $1,800 come from? You and Dad said you were tight this month. She paused again. Longer this time. We sold Marcus's computer. I have spent a lot of time, in the months since this happened, trying to reconstruct exactly what I felt in that moment. I think the clearest way I can describe it is this: it was not rage. Rage would have been easier. Rage is hot and fast, and it burns through and leaves you hollow but clean. What I felt was colder than that. It was a kind of clarifying quiet, like the moment right before an alarm goes off, when everything is absolutely still. You sold his computer, I said. He plays too many video games anyway. She said it with a small, practiced certainty. We did him a favor, honestly. He was spending too much time on it. And Devin needed. Mom. I stopped her. That computer was Marcus's. He paid for it himself. Every dollar. He earned that money on a paper route for nearly 2 years. Renata. Where is it now? Who did you sell it to? A woman on Facebook Marketplace. The woman had already picked it up. Transaction completed. $1,800 in cash, handed to my father, deposited into Devon's account the following morning. I sat with the phone pressed against my ear for 4 full seconds, and then I said, very quietly, "I'll call you back," and I hung up. I did not call back that night. What I did instead was sit on the edge of Marcus's bed. He was at school, it was mid-afternoon, and look at the empty desk where the tower used to sit. There was still a ring in the dust from the base of the case. A cable with no machine on the other end. The monitor was still there, because apparently whoever my mother sold it to didn't want the monitor. It was just sitting there, screen dark, connected to nothing. I called Ms. Bryce. I don't fully know why. Maybe because I knew she understood what the machine meant in a way that was professional and external and wouldn't get tangled up in the feeling I was trying not to have. I explained what had happened, very briefly, and she was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Can I ask, when did they sell it?" I told her the date. November 6th. Another pause. "Renata," she said, "I need to tell you something about what Marcus had been doing with that machine." She asked if we could meet. I said yes. She suggested the following Tuesday, at the school, during her prep period. I said that was fine. And then I sat on the edge of Marcus's bed for another few minutes before I went to pick him up from school. That night I told Marcus what had happened. I told him plainly, without softening it beyond what was true, because he was 12 and not fragile and deserved to know. He listened. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and listened with his hands flat on the table in front of him, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "They sold it," he said. "Yes." "To give Devon money for Las Vegas." "Yes." He was quiet again. Then, "Did they know how much work I did to get it?" "They knew," I said. "Your grandmother knew about your paper route." I told her. He nodded once. Very slowly. And then he said, "Okay," and he went to his room. Not okay as in this is fine. More like okay as in I'm putting that away now, because I don't want to feel it in front of anyone. He was so 12. And so much older than 12. I did not call my parents back that week. I made a decision in that kitchen that was quiet and clear. I was going to the meeting with Ms. Bryce. I was going to hear what she had to say. And then I was going to figure out what to do next in a way that reflected what had actually happened, not what felt like a release valve for the anger I was managing. My father called me on Thursday. "Your mother says she told you about the computer. I want you to know it was the right decision. Marcus has a problem with screen time and..." "I'm not having this conversation right now, Dad." "Renata. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk about it." I hung up. The Tuesday meeting with Ms. Bryce happened at 2:15 in the afternoon, 11 days after the sale. Her classroom at Hadley Middle School smelled like whiteboard marker and the specific warm plastic smell of a lot of computers running in a small space. She had a collection of circuit boards mounted on a corkboard behind her desk, labeled in her neat handwriting. She offered me coffee from a Mr. Coffee machine on the windowsill. I said yes. She pulled up something on her laptop and turned it so I could see the screen. "Marcus has been developing something in my after-school program for the past 4 months," she said. "He started in September. I only found out the full scope of it about 3 weeks ago. What I was looking at was a GitHub repository. Public, with a proper README file and version commits going back to September 4th. It's a diagnostic tool," Ms. Bryce said, "for identifying early hardware failure signatures in mid-range consumer PCs. He built it to run passive monitoring in the background and flag specific error patterns before they become critical failures. He modeled it on some academic papers I shared with the class, journals from IEEE, which most 6th graders don't read independently, but Marcus read all 3 of them the week I mentioned them. I looked at the commit history. The most recent push was November 3rd, 3 days before my parents sold the machine. He hadn't told me the exact scope of what he was building, Ms. Bryce continued. I knew he was working on a project, and I'd been giving him feedback on the architecture, but the full version, I saw it for the first time about 3 weeks ago when he pushed a major update. She paused. "Renata, the tool works. It's not a student project in the sense of something charming and symbolic. It functions. I showed it to a friend of mine who works in IT infrastructure at Carolina's Healthcare, and she asked if Marcus had a mentor program she could refer him to. She also said that with refinement, this application would have commercial viability. She let that land. He built it on that computer, Ms. Bryce said. The processing power was a factor. He'd told me he needed the GPU for some of the load testing. He was 3 weeks from a milestone he'd set for himself. He was going to submit it to a student innovation competition in February. I looked at the monitor in front of me. The February competition. The GitHub repository. The commit dated November 3rd, 3 days before. Can he rebuild? I asked. He can continue the development on school equipment. We'll make it work. But the machine, she stopped. That machine was his first serious hardware environment. It was custom to his workflow. He knew exactly what it would do and wouldn't do because he'd built it from scratch and lived in it for 3 months. She took a breath. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what was in that computer. Not just money. A body of work. I didn't say anything for a moment. I was looking at the commit history again. September 4th, October 11th, October 29th, November 3rd. The last entry. MS. Bryce, I said, would you be willing to say what you just told me directly to my parents? She looked at me across the desk. Yes, she said. I would. I called my parents that evening. I said I wanted to talk about what happened. I suggested a meeting at the school. My mother said that seemed unnecessary. Couldn't we just discuss it as a family? I said I thought it would be useful to have Marcus's teacher present, since the computer was primarily a school tool. My father said he didn't see why a teacher needed to be involved in a family matter. Because what got sold was part of a school project, I said. And the teacher has something to tell you about it. A short silence. Fine, my father said. We'll come. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. My brother Devin was not invited. He was in Las Vegas by then anyway. The trip had happened the week prior. He'd posted a photo from the Shadow Creek golf course to Instagram on Saturday morning with the caption cold water, warm weather, blessed. My parents arrived at Hadley Middle School at 4 p.m. on January 22nd, 2026. I had taken a half day from the office. Marcus was at after-school programming in another room. My parents walked into Ms. Bryce's classroom, and my mother commented that it was nice, which was her default compliment for spaces that confused her. My father shook Ms. Bryce's hand and introduced himself with the particular courtesy he extends to authority figures he wants to be liked by. Ms. Bryce offered them coffee. They accepted. We sat in a small cluster of adult height chairs she'd arranged near the front of the room, away from the student desks, more neutral. More like a meeting than a classroom. My father sat slightly forward in his chair with his hands on his knees. He had the posture of someone who expects a conversation to resolve quickly and in their favor. We appreciate you making time, he said. Of course, Ms. Bryce said. I wanted to talk about Marcus. He's been one of the most remarkable students I've worked with in my 12 years of teaching computer science. I want to give you some context about what he was doing this fall. She pulled up the GitHub repository on her laptop and turned it toward them.